Hey folks, so today we're going to be talking about counter arguments, and I'm going to be talking about some different ways that you can acknowledge opposing viewpoints within your own argument or within your own essay. And a lot of this information comes from chapter 6 of They Say, I Say, Planning a Naysayer in Your Writing, which I encourage you to check out. This is kind of a truncated or shortened version of the information found in chapter 6 of They Say, I Say. However, in this lecture, I'll actually have some examples of counter arguments that are associated with Proposition 12 so that you can see what this would look like or how this could look like in your own arguments, either for or against Proposition 12. Okay, so let's go ahead and get started with our slideshow. So first, I want to talk about the purpose of bringing in a counter argument or a concession or an exception into your own essay. I've had students ask me, doesn't this weaken my argument if I talk about other viewpoints? Doesn't that show that my argument's weak? And I just want to say absolutely not, right? It only makes you sound, more logical and more open-minded to do this, because there's always a counterpoint, right? There's always a reason why folks are, thinking about an argument from the other side. So being able to address that and recognize that only establishes your own credibility and shows that you're willing to think about and willing to respond to objections. Essentially, it allows you, and you see in this image, it allows you to go beyond just tipping your hat to an opponent, right? It shows that you're willing to stop and have a conversation with the opposing side. Okay, so I'm going to talk about two strategies for counter arguments, and I'm actually going to have an entire paragraph for these two types of strategies. So you might stop and read the paragraph here because I know it's a lot of text to digest, but I think it's important for us to actually look at these strategies in practice. Okay, so the first way to bring in an opposing viewpoint is to have an exception paragraph. Now, exception paragraphs are usually the very first body paragraph or very last body paragraph of an essay. And essentially, you use an exception paragraph to say, hey, my argument's accurate and true except for this instance, right? And a lot of you had this in your Leslie Bisgold evaluations where you said, hey, this was great, this was great, this was great, except for this, right? And you brought up one of the weaknesses in her argument. So some of you are already doing this. But I would like us to look at an exception paragraph for Proposition 12. Now, this came at the end of the essay, right? It was the last body paragraph. And the essay had mainly been about why Proposition 12 was important to pass and why it should be passed in November. So let's go ahead and take a look at this exception paragraph. So the writer writes, though Proposition 12 will help protect animals from living in inhumane conditions, there is one pitfall to passing this proposition, an increase in egg prices. So let's pause there. Notice they have this transition sentence saying, though Proposition 12 will help protect, right, which has been their main argument, but then they have this sentence, there is one pitfall, right? They acknowledge that there's a downfall or there's a negative to Proposition 12. Okay, so that's a good topic sentence. Let's move on to what they have to say next. Specifically, according to the United States Department of Agriculture, USDA, egg prices are already expected to rise in California. Egg prices are expected to increase 9 to 10% in 2018 and an additional 2 to 3% in 2019. Let's pause. So notice how they bring in the USDA and the USDA's report on an increase in egg prices already. Right? So they're saying, hey, yeah, these egg prices are going to increase, and if the USDA, especially if the USDA is right. Okay, let's see what comes after the quotation. If the USDA's information is accurate, then consumers will have to pay more at the grocery store for eggs. That's a beautiful sentence. Notice it transitions us as readers from the quotation back into the writer's argument. They have that lovely phrase, if the USDA's information is accurate. And then notice how they finish. Though this does not mean that voters should vote no on Proposition 12, it does mean that measures will need to be put into place to make sure that underprivileged Californians are not unjustly affected by this initiative. So notice what the students done here. They started by reminding readers of their point, though Proposition 12 will help protect animals from living in inhumane conditions. They've then brought up a downfall, right, an opposing viewpoint. They've acknowledged the validity of this viewpoint, but then they've said it does not mean that we shouldn't vote yes. Doesn't mean that we should vote no because of this. It just means that we need to think about this downfall, right? So this is a pretty good example of an exception paragraph, right? It's a paragraph that essentially says, my argument's right, my argument's strong, except in this instance. Okay, let's look at another type of counterargument paragraph. This is a rebuttal strategy, which essentially is where you bring up an objection and then you talk about why that objection is invalid. So in the prior example, they talked about, hey, this is a valid argument, counterargument. In this example, you bring up the opposition and say, but this is invalid. This is a bad viewpoint. Again, I know this is a lot of text, so you might take a pause and read through this because I know it's a lot to digest, but there is some important things that I want us to talk about here. Okay, so let's go ahead and get into this rebuttal paragraph. So, and you'll notice that this is one that that I created from the prior exception paragraph, but essentially I've changed it to be a rebuttal. So you'll notice a lot of the same arguments at work, but I've included a rebuttal in this example. Okay. Though Proposition 12 will help protect animals from living in inhumane conditions, some opponents of the proposition argue that there is a big pitfall to passing this proposition, an increase in egg prices. So notice the change in the topic sentence. Rather than saying, like the exception paragraph, there is a downfall, notice in this one they say some opponents of the proposition argue. So we can already tell they're not saying that, they're saying the opponents say that. Okay, notice they bring in the same information, right? These opponents note that according to the United States Department of Agriculture, USDA prices, blah, 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 blah. So the same information is brought in. But notice what comes after the quotation. However, what these arguments fail to note, that's a beautiful transitional phrase. Notice how it says it's essentially the opposite of the exception paragraph where they talked about why that was a good point. Here they're talking about why this is a failing point. Okay, so let's check out what they say. However, what these arguments fail to note is that farms across the state have already been asked to meet the requirements put forward in Proposition 12. As California's nonpartisan fiscal and policy advisor notes in its overview of Prop 12, state law passed after Proposition 2 made it illegal for businesses in California to sell eggs that they knew came from hens housed in ways that do not meet Proposition 2's standards for egg-laying hens. Ooh, so notice they brought in another source. They brought in the nonpartisan fiscal and policy advisor to show that these standards are actually already in place. But they can't just drop that in, right? They have to explicate their quotation. So they say, as this information shows, a prior proposition was already passed that set standards for ethical egg production on California farms. Therefore, voters should not worry about an increase egg prices since California farms have already been asked to meet a similar set of standards. Ultimately, when it comes to egg production, Proposition 12 is simply reinforcing policies that have already been approved. Okay, so notice, unlike the exception paragraph, This paragraph goes deeply into why the opposing viewpoint is wrong. They bring in information, they bring in a source to show that Proposition 2 already says essentially the same thing that Proposition 12 says regarding egg prices, and then they remind the reader that therefore voters should not really worry about the spike in egg prices. So as you're beginning work on your Proposition 12 essay, consider those opposing viewpoints. And if there's one that you think is especially valid, you might bring that in as an exception paragraph. Now, you don't want to say, okay, I'm wrong, right? This paragraph changes everything, but you do just want to say, make that concession and say, hey, there's one thing that we need to consider with this. Or if you think that an opposing viewpoint isn't really valid, you could bring in a counter argument with a rebuttal to say, hey, some folks say this, but this is why they're wrong. In either case, counter arguments are a great way to show that you're thinking beyond your own argument, and they help build your credibility as a writer. So I encourage you to think about including a counter argument paragraph in your Proposition 12 essay.